Hello, my name is Martina, also known as Marilyn Cosplay, and today I will make a waistcoat for my historically accurate Captain Amelia cosplay from Treasure Planet. With historically accuracy, I describe this as a sort of loose term, as this is my interpretation of someone else's interpretation of a waistcoat from this time period. Since my plan all along has been to set this in the time period of Treasure Island, and the book is supposedly set in the late 1750s, I think it's reasonable to use this 1760s waistcoat pattern that I found in The Cut of Men's Clothing by Norah Waugh, since I haven't actually found a specific 1750 pattern. I'm gonna do some small changes since the fashion of men's clothing sort of is a gradual change. I'm gonna sort of seek some inspiration from the earlier pattern that's dated around 1740 and keep the buttons all the way down the front. So of course I'm gonna keep that for the waistcoat as well, since they do sort of have to match. So my plan now is to scale this up to my own size and see how it goes from there. So here's the scaled up measurements. I've used the inches on the side of the pattern as a guide and just used some math and scaled that up to normal size. I'm gonna have a look at some of the patterns I already have for vests from earlier projects and match the measurements up against those before I make my actual pattern. But I don't think these measurements are too far off. This is the constructed front and back piece, and actually I was lucky enough that the scaled up measurements actually pretty well fit with my own. So if I'm lucky, basically the entire pattern that I'm working from will actually be basically my size. So now I'm gonna make a mock-up and see if I need to change a few things. For instance, I didn't do the crooked line of the back now, since I didn't want to actually have to calculate where it was gonna go inwards to get the right curve at the back. So I'm just gonna figure out where that's gonna be in the mock-up and then adjust the patterns accordingly. And also, that's the same with where I want to place my pockets and buttonholes and stuff like that. I'm gonna figure out the fit first before I do anything of that. I use whatever that's convenient to lay close to me to weight down the pattern, and then I use a soft pencil to mark all around my pattern pieces. Then I'm adding a 1 centimeter wide seam allowance all around. Cut the pieces. Pin all of the pieces together. And sew them all together with your sewing machine. So now I've done the last adjustments on the mock-up and put it over the shirt just to see how it will look. And I feel that the shape is really good now. I've used some pins in the front as buttons. I'm gonna use this mock-up fabric as the lining of the vest, as you obviously wouldn't throw away perfectly good cotton in the 1750s, 60s. Obviously the normal thing to use as a lining would probably be a silk, but I opted out of using silk for this project due to both costs and basically because you can't wash it in the washing machine, and I really want to have that opportunity. So this is the new shape of my pattern pieces after I've made them the same shape as my mock-up. And the thing I'm realizing now is that these pieces actually look way more similar to the pattern in the book than what I started with. So apparently they knew what they were talking about back then. Who knew? I should actually have expected that was what's gonna happen. So for making the entire waistcoat, you need 2 pieces of each of these in your main fabric, except this one, which is the pocket lining, and you will also need 2 of each for your lining. Same way I marked my cotton earlier, I do the same for my main fabric, which is a soft linen, and I used 1 meter for this project. Both the linen and cotton has already been pre-washed and ironed. My pocket lining has the same shape and size as an A4 piece of paper with rounded corners. I marked that from a piece of fabric that I did a mistake on earlier to not waste the excess fabric. I also cut the lining for the pocket flap from this fabric. I added 1 centimeter seam allowance for the pocket flap, but not for the pocket lining. Then cut these pieces as well. I then overlock all of my fabric pieces just to be unhistorically accurate. This is to keep them from fraying. This will be on the inside and is totally invisible. So we're gonna make welt pockets that's gonna go under pocket flaps. So now I have marked a hole for where I want the actual hole opening for the pocket. And I've taken my pocket lining and marked the hole onto that, because that's gonna be my guide for sewing it on. I'm gonna fold over the top seam when that's going through the front piece of the coat, and then it will be able to fold perfectly halfway on the inside. Since it's easier to do pockets while the piece is flat, I'm gonna mark up both and cut and fasten the welt pocket first before I sew everything together. And since it's also easier to mark where I want my buttonholes to go, I also made some small cuts in the pattern where the buttonholes are supposed to go, and I'm also going to mark that up. I am marking on the right side of my fabric, so it's important to be careful when you mark. Remember, buttonholes on men's clothing are always on the left side. I match up the markings on the pocket lining with the markings on the front piece, and then I pin it in place and try to keep the pins a bit away from the marked lines so they won't be in the way of the sewing machine foot. Sew the top and the bottom line. Cut in the middle between your top and bottom seam, and then you notch as close as you can to the corners at both edges. Turn your pocket lining and the welt inside out and then iron it. To stabilize the welt further, I'm doing a top stitch over the bottom line of the welt pocket opening when everything is folded outwards. I then fold the pocket lining into its right position and then do a top stitch around the rest of the pocket opening. For the top part, I'm doing the top stitching at the actual lining fabric. Then sew around the edge of your pocket lining to close your pocket. Pin the main fabric of the pocket flap to the lining and pin them together on 3 sides. Do not pin the top. Sew that with your sewing machine. Cut away the excess fabric on the corners and clip your curves. Then you turn the pocket flap inside out and use something pointy to sort of get the corners to lie the way they're supposed to do. Hold your seam allowance in between the layers and pin everything in place. I then use an overcasting stitch and sew the 2 layers together. Then press your pocket flap. Pin your pocket flap in the right position. I then use a felling stitch to fasten the pocket flap. Pin all of your waistcoat pieces together. Then sew that with your sewing machine. Press the seams on both your lining and your main fabric. Pin your lining fabric to your main fabric with the right sides facing towards each other. Remember to leave a place where you can turn the waistcoat right side out. Sew your lining to your main fabric. Cut away the excess fabric in the seam allowance on the corners and clip the curves. When you have turned the waistcoat the right side out, make sure to press all of your edges. Pin down the seam allowance on the remaining seams and pin that together. Then I use an overcasting stitch to secure it. Fold and pin in place your back pleats, and then you use a felling stitch to fasten it. Make sure to only catch the lining fabric. Then you press it flat with your iron. Clip the seam allowance on your armholes on both the main fabric and the lining fabric. Then fold your seam allowance inwards and pin the 2 layers together. Afterwards, I use an overcasting stitch to secure it. I then sew on my trim with a running stitch along the edges. Make sure to not catch the lining fabric. Before I add trim to the pockets, I wanted to make the waistcoat functional, so I've gone over my markings from earlier to make them more visible. And also it's nice to go over it again after I've added the trim, so each buttonhole will be have the same distance from the trim to make it look more even. Your buttonholes. Make sure to follow the grain line of the fabric. Try with your buttons to see if it actually goes through the hole. To secure a buttonhole, you take your needle through the buttonhole and take it part way through, a couple of millimeters away from the opening. Then you take the tails of the thread underneath the needle, up around the needle tip, and then you tighten the thread in a downward motion. You will then get a small knot on the inside of the hole. Repeat that all the way around the hole with maybe a millimeter in between each stitch. I noticed that on some extant garments they had the buttons at the edge of the coat on top of the trim, so I decided to do that as well. Then I added trim to my pocket flap using a running stitch. And then after I ironed my entire waistcoat, it was finished. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, and please consider leaving a like and maybe even a subscribe.